In the late summer of 1842, beneath the unrelenting Louisiana sun, there existed a world built upon stolen lives and forced labor. The cotton fields stretched across the delta like a white ocean, each bowl a testament to blood and sweat, each row a monument to human endurance. It was here, in this landscape of oppression, that a man named Jonas lived and worked. His days measured not in hours, but in the weight of the cotton sack upon his shoulders and the ache that settled deep into his bones with each passing season. Before we get started, tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. We always love hearing from you, and if you enjoy these stories, a quick like really helps support the channel. Now get comfortable and enjoy the story. Jonas was not a man who spoke loudly or drew attention to himself. In a system designed to crush individuality, he had learned the art of invisibility, the wisdom of keeping his thoughts locked behind a careful mask of obedience. Those who knew him saw a steady worker, reliable and composed, a man who could be counted upon to meet his quota without complaint or rebellion. But beneath this surface lay a mind of remarkable depth, a spirit that observed everything and forgot nothing, a heart that beat with the quiet dignity of one who endures because he must, not because he has surrendered. The plantation where Jonas labored belonged to a man named Nathaniel Crawford, a wealthy landowner whose fortune had been built upon the bodies of those he claimed as property. The great house stood at the edge of the fields, its white columns gleaming in the sunlight, a symbol of wealth extracted from soil and soul alike. But it was not Crawford who ruled the daily lives of the enslaved. That power belonged to another man, one whose presence cast a shadow darker than any storm cloud that rolled across the delta sky. Harlan Pierce was the overseer, and he wore his authority like a weapon. Tall and lean, with pale eyes that seemed to hold no warmth, Pierce moved through the fields with the confidence of a man who believed himself ordained to control the destinies of others. He carried a whip coiled at his belt, and he used it with a precision that suggested practice and pleasure intertwined. Pierce did not simply enforce the brutal rules of the plantation system. He seemed to take pride in perfecting them, in finding new ways to extract labor and instill fear. He would walk the rows at dawn, watching as the workers filed out from their quarters, his gaze cataloging every movement, every expression. He knew which workers were strongest, which were sick, which had children they loved more than their own survival. This knowledge was his currency, and he spent it freely. If a woman slowed her picking because her hands bled, Pierce would threaten her children. If a man showed defiance in his eyes, even silent defiance, Pierce would ensure that man learned the price of pride. The overseer often spoke of the land, as if it were his partner in dominion. He would stand at the edge of the fields and declare that the soil listened to him, that the earth itself obeyed his commands. In his twisted philosophy, the cotton grew because he willed it, and the people who tended it were no different from the mules that pulled the plows. Pierce believed that the plantation thrived through the systematic breaking of spirits, and he pursued this goal with the dedication of a craftsman perfecting his trade. Jonas had witnessed Pierce's cruelty for 8 long years. He had seen men whipped until they could not stand, women separated from their children as casually as one might sort seeds from chaff, families torn apart to satisfy ledgers and accounts in Crawford's study. Each act of violence, each casual brutality, Jonas stored away in the deep recesses of his memory. He did not speak of what he saw. He did not protest or plead. He simply watched and remembered and continued to survive. But survival alone cannot sustain the human spirit indefinitely. There comes a moment when endurance transforms into something else, when the accumulated weight of injustice demands more than silent witness. For Jonas, that moment arrived on a sweltering afternoon in late August, when the air hung heavy with moisture and the sun beat down upon the fields with merciless intensity. Her name was Eliza, and she was Jonas's wife in every way that mattered. They had spoken vows not in a church, but beneath the old oak tree at the edge of the quarters, with only the stars as witnesses. They had built a life together within the narrow confines allowed them, finding moments of tenderness in a world designed to deny such things. Eliza had a laugh that could lighten even the darkest days, and hands that moved with grace whether picking cotton or braiding hair. She sang spirituals in a voice that carried across the fields, melodies of hope and longing that reminded everyone who heard them that they were more than what the system claimed they were. On that August afternoon, Eliza was working in the eastern section of the field, her cotton sack half full, her movements steady despite the heat. Pierce had been in a foul mood since morning, snapping at workers over minor infractions, his whip hand twitching as if eager for use. He approached Eliza's row and stopped, watching her work with narrowed eyes. She was moving more slowly than usual, her fingers fumbling slightly as she pulled the bolls from their pods. The truth was simple and human. She was pregnant, though it was early still, and the heat and exertion were taking their toll. But to Pierce, her pace represented defiance, laziness, a challenge to his authority that demanded correction. What happened next unfolded with terrible swiftness. Pierce grabbed Eliza by the arm, jerking her upright, and began to berate her in a voice loud enough to carry across multiple rows. Other workers stopped, their hands frozen in mid-motion, knowing that to intervene meant death, knowing that to look away was to abandon one of their own. Jonas, working 3 rows over, heard the commotion and felt his heart seize in his chest. Pierce's rage escalated beyond words. The whip came free from his belt, and he struck Eliza across the back once, twice, and then again with increasing force. She fell to her knees, her hands raised in a futile gesture of protection. The other workers stood paralyzed by horror and helplessness, their faces reflecting the awful understanding that they were witnessing a murder they could not prevent. Jonas dropped his cotton sack and began to run, but the distance between them stretched like an eternity. By the time he reached Eliza's row, Pierce had struck her a final devastating blow. She collapsed forward into the cotton plants, her blood darkening the white bowls, her body suddenly, terribly still. Pierce stepped back, breathing hard, his face flushed with exertion and something that might have been satisfaction. He looked at Jonas with cold indifference and said that the woman had brought it upon herself, that disobedience could not be tolerated, that this should serve as a lesson to all who witnessed it. Then he walked away, leaving Jonas kneeling in the dirt beside the woman he loved, her hand already growing cold in his. The overseer ordered Jonas to bury Eliza that same evening before the body could draw flies or cause disruption to the work schedule. It was a final cruelty, forcing a man to dig the grave of his murdered wife, to lower her body into the earth with his own hands. Jonas performed this task in silence, his face showing nothing, his movements methodical and precise. The other workers stood nearby, bearing witness, their presence a kind of collective mourning that needed no words. He buried her in the cotton field, in the same soil where she had labored, where her blood had already seeped into the ground. As he packed the earth over her grave, something fundamental shifted within Jonas. The grief that filled him did not break his spirit. Instead, it forged it into something harder, something purposeful. Each shovelful of dirt became a vow, each moment of silence a promise that Eliza's death would not be meaningless, that the man who had killed her would face a reckoning. In the days that followed, Jonas returned to work as if nothing had changed. He picked his cotton, met his quota, spoke when spoken to, and maintained the careful mask of obedience that had kept him alive for so many years. But beneath this surface, his mind had become a different instrument entirely. Where before he had thought only of survival, now he thought of justice. Where before he had endured, now he planned. Jonas began to study Harlan Pierce with new eyes. He observed the overseer's routines with the attention of a man whose life depended upon understanding every detail. Pierce rode through the fields at dawn and dusk, following the same paths, checking the same sections of plantation. He kept a rigid schedule, taking pride in his predictability, believing it demonstrated discipline and control. At night, he made rounds through the quarters and along the field edges, a lantern in one hand, his whip in the other, ensuring that no one moved after curfew, that no plans could be made under cover of darkness. But predictability, Jonas understood, was a weakness. A man who follows the same patterns day after day becomes vulnerable to those who watch and wait. Pierce's confidence in his own authority had made him careless in certain ways. He walked alone through the fields at night, believing that his position protected him, that no enslaved person would dare raise a hand against him. This assumption would prove to be his fatal mistake. Jonas knew that vengeance sought in haste would lead only to his own death and likely to reprisals against others. If he acted impulsively, if he struck Pierce in anger without preparation, he would be caught, tortured, and executed, and his act would change nothing. But if he planned with care, if he used the same patience and intelligence that had allowed him to survive, he might accomplish something more than simple revenge. He might demonstrate that even in the most oppressive system, the human mind remains unconquerable, capable of resistance that no chains could prevent. The plan took shape slowly, carefully, over weeks of observation and thought. Jonas realized that the cotton field itself could become his ally. The rows stretched for acres, creating a maze where one section looked much like another, especially in darkness. The soil was loose from constant tilling, easy to dig and easy to disguise. The cotton plants grew tall in late summer, their branches creating walls of white that could hide much from casual observation. And the field held meaning beyond its practical utility. It was here that Eliza had died, here that she lay buried. To use this place as the site of justice seemed not only fitting but necessary, a way of honoring her memory while exacting the price that Pierce owed. Jonas chose a section of field that lay between two main paths, a spot that Pierce would pass through during his nightly rounds, but that remained distant enough from the quarters and the main house to muffle sound. Over 3 moonless nights, working in absolute silence, Jonas dug his trap. He used a shovel borrowed from the tool shed, its blade sharpened to cut through roots and packed earth. Each night he worked for hours, removing soil and placing it carefully aside, digging deeper until the pit measured roughly 6 feet deep, 8 feet long, and 4 feet wide. A grave, essentially, though one designed for a living man rather than a corpse. The physical labor was immense, made more challenging by the need for absolute secrecy. Jonas could not afford to be discovered, could not risk anyone else being implicated in what he was doing. He timed his work to coincide with the grinding of the old windmill that stood at the field's edge, using its rhythmic creaking to mask the sound of his digging. He studied the position of the stars to track the hours, knowing he had to complete his work and return to the quarters before the first hint of dawn. Once the pit was complete, Jonas covered it with thin boards salvaged from broken crates, arranged them carefully, then concealed everything beneath a layer of loose cotton stalks and scattered soil. The trap looked like nothing more than a slightly disturbed section of field, the kind of minor irregularity that would draw no attention in the daytime and be invisible in the darkness of night. Jonas tested the covering himself, stepping lightly on the edges to ensure it would support a casual footstep, but collapse under full weight at the center. The final element of the plan required the most dangerous manipulation. Jonas needed to ensure that Pierce would walk directly over the trap, and to do that, He needed to give the overseer a reason to investigate that specific section of field. He decided to create the illusion of escape, to plant evidence that would suggest someone had run, that their trail led directly into the heart of the cotton rows. On the chosen night, Jonas tore a piece of fabric from an old shirt and left it snagged on a fence post near the quarters. He scuffed the ground to suggest hasty footsteps. He broke branches along the field's edge, creating a path that led inward toward his trap. The false trail was subtle enough to seem genuine, but obvious enough that Pierce, with his tracker's pride, would follow it. Everything was in place. Now Jonas needed only to wait for the moment to act, to put into motion the plan that would transform him from victim to agent of his own justice. As he lay in his bed that night, listening to the sounds of other enslaved people sleeping around him, Jonas felt no uncertainty. The grief for Eliza remained, would always remain, a wound that time could ease but never heal. But alongside the grief now existed something else, a quiet determination, a sense of purpose that gave meaning to his continued survival. Pierce had believed that violence could break any spirit, that the system of slavery was unassailable because it controlled bodies absolutely. Jonas was about to prove him wrong. The overseer had forgotten that while chains could bind a body, they could not imprison a mind that refused to surrender, that planned and calculated and waited for the perfect moment to strike back against injustice. That moment was coming, and when it arrived, Jonas would be ready. The cotton field that had witnessed so much suffering would soon bear witness to something else entirely. The moment when an enslaved man reclaimed his humanity through an act of calculated resistance that no overseer, no system, no amount of violence could prevent or undo. The morning after Jonas completed his trap, he rose before dawn as he always did, his body moving through the familiar rhythms of plantation life while his mind remained focused on what was to come. Everything depended on his ability to appear unchanged, to give no indication that anything significant had shifted. Suspicion would unravel everything. The slightest deviation from his normal demeanor could draw Pierce's attention in ways that would make the plan impossible. So Jonas worked that day as he had worked every day before, his hands steady in the cotton rows, his face showing nothing but the patient endurance of a man who has learned to make himself invisible to those who wield power over him. But invisibility, Jonas had come to understand, was its own form of power. To be overlooked was to be underestimated, and to be underestimated was to possess an advantage that the confident and cruel could never recognize until too late. Pierce saw the enslaved people around him as simple creatures capable only of basic labor and animal emotions. He could not imagine that men and women denied education, denied freedom, denied even the acknowledgement of their full humanity might possess intellectual capabilities equal or superior to his own. This blindness was systemic, built into the very foundation of slavery's justification. If enslaved people were truly inferior, then their bondage could be rationalized. But if they were fully human, fully intelligent, fully capable of complex thought and planning, then the entire edifice of oppression revealed itself for what it was, a crime against consciousness itself. Jonas understood this perhaps better than most. He had taught himself to read, secretly over years, studying scraps of newspaper that blew into the quarters, memorizing words from signs, piecing together the alphabet from letters he glimpsed on shipping crates and barrels. He had learned mathematics by counting cotton bolls, by calculating weights and yields in his head, by observing how the overseers kept their records. His mind was a library of information, accumulated slowly, patiently, stored away against some future need that he had not fully understood until Eliza's death gave him purpose. Now that purpose guided his every action. In the days following the completion of his trap, Jonas began the careful work of redirecting Pierce's attention. He knew that for his plan to succeed, the overseer's suspicion needed to be focused elsewhere, on some other target, some other perceived threat. Fortunately, the paranoid nature of the slave system provided opportunities for manipulation. Overseers and plantation owners lived in constant fear of rebellion, of escape, of the possibility that those they oppressed might organize and resist. This fear could be exploited. Jonas chose his moment carefully. He selected another worker, a young man named Marcus, who was known for a quick temper and a history of minor infractions. Marcus was not part of Jonas's plan, knew nothing about what was coming, but his reputation made him useful as a distraction. During the midday water break, Jonas made certain that Pierce overheard a conversation in which Marcus's name was mentioned in connection with the word running, spoken just loudly enough to catch the overseer's ear, but quietly enough to seem like something that was not meant to be overheard. Pierce's reaction was immediate and predictable, his attention fixed on Marcus with laser focus. For the next 2 days, the overseer watched the young man constantly, following him through the fields, questioning other workers about his behavior, searching his sleeping area for evidence of escape plans. Marcus, bewildered by the sudden scrutiny, became nervous and defensive, which only reinforced Pierce's suspicions. The overseer became convinced that he had identified a potential runaway, and his pride in his own vigilance made him more confident, more certain of his ability to control every aspect of plantation life. This false confidence was exactly what Jonas needed. While Pierce focused on Marcus, Jonas moved freely, making his final preparations. He checked the trap each night, ensuring that recent rains had not softened the covering too much, that no animal had disturbed the carefully arranged stalks, that everything remained in place. He studied the moon's phases, knowing that he needed darkness for his plan to work, waiting for the right night when clouds would obscure even the faint light of stars. Other workers began to notice small changes in Jonas's behavior, subtle shifts that only those who knew him well could detect. He stayed to himself more than usual, his eyes sometimes distant, as if his thoughts were far from the present moment. Old Sarah, who had known him since he arrived on the plantation, watched him with knowing eyes. She had buried 3 children and a husband, had survived longer than most, had learned to read the signs of a person preparing to do something dangerous. One evening, as Jonas walked past her cabin, she reached out and touched his arm gently, saying nothing, but her eyes conveying understanding and a kind of blessing. Others, too, seemed to sense that something was building, some shift in the atmosphere that could not be named but was felt nonetheless. This unspoken awareness among the enslaved community created a protective web around Jonas's actions. When he moved through the quarters at night, checking his trap one final time, no one questioned his movements. When he borrowed tools or asked subtle questions about Pierce's schedule, the information flowed freely. No one knew exactly what Jonas was planning, but they understood it in general terms, and they chose to know nothing that could be extracted under torture, while simultaneously ensuring that Jonas had what he needed. This collective protection, this community's silent conspiracy of ignorance and support, was itself an act of resistance, a way of caring for one of their own while maintaining plausible deniability. The night Jonas chose for his plan's execution arrived with heavy cloud cover and a stillness in the air that suggested approaching weather. It was a Thursday, unremarkable in every way except for the absence of moonlight and the fact that Pierce would be making his rounds along the eastern field path, following the schedule he maintained with clockwork precision. Jonas ate his evening ration of cornbread and fatback without tasting it, his mind reviewing every step of what was to come, checking for flaws, considering contingencies. He waited in his quarters until the sound of Pierce's boots announced the beginning of the nightly rounds. The overseer carried a lantern, its light bobbing through the darkness as he walked, checking the locked doors of the cabins, ensuring that everyone was accounted for and contained. Jonas listened to the footsteps approach and then recede, counting silently to himself, measuring the time it would take Pierce to reach the far end of the quarters and then circle back toward the field paths. When the moment came, Jonas slipped out through a loose board at the back of his cabin, an exit he had prepared weeks ago for exactly this purpose. He moved through the darkness with practiced ease, his feet finding their way along familiar paths, his body low to avoid being silhouetted against the sky. He circled wide, reaching the eastern edge of the cotton field ahead of Pierce, positioning himself near the false trail he had created. Now came the most dangerous part. Jonas needed to draw Pierce into the field, to lure him directly over the trap, and to do so in a way that seemed natural, that aroused no suspicion. He picked up a stone and threw it against a tree branch, creating a sound like someone moving through underbrush. Then he waited, barely breathing, listening for Pierce's reaction. The overseer heard the noise and stopped. Jonas could hear him speaking to himself, curse words muttered under his breath, followed by the click of the whip being uncoiled. Pierce moved toward the sound, his lantern swinging in wide arcs, searching for movement. Jonas threw another stone, further into the field this time, creating the impression of someone fleeing deeper into the rows. Pierce followed, his pride as a tracker overriding any caution. He found the torn fabric Jonas had planted, examined it in the lantern light, and grunted with satisfaction. The false trail led exactly where Jonas wanted him to go, and the overseer followed it with the confidence of a man who had pursued runaways many times before. Jonas moved parallel to Pierce, staying hidden in the cotton rows, guiding the overseer's progress with carefully placed sounds, always keeping just out of sight, always drawing him forward. They were approaching the trap now. Jonas could feel his heart pounding, not with fear but with focused intensity. Everything had to happen precisely right. Pierce needed to step exactly where the trap was weakest, needed to be caught off guard, needed to fall before he could react or cry out. Jonas picked up another stone, ready to make one more sound, one final lure that would position Pierce directly over the covered pit. But before he could throw it, Pierce stopped. The overseer stood motionless, his lantern held high, his head cocked to one side as if listening. For a terrible moment, Jonas thought the plan had been discovered, that Pierce had somehow sensed the trap. The two men stood frozen in the darkness, separated by 20 feet of cotton plants. One hunting, one hunted, both acutely aware that something significant was unfolding. Then Pierce spoke, his voice carrying through the still air with casual cruelty. He called out that he knew someone was there, that running was pointless, that whoever had thought to escape would pay dearly for their foolishness. He promised pain and punishment, described in detail what he would do once he caught the runaway. His words dripped with sadistic anticipation, revealing the pleasure he took in the prospect of inflicting suffering. Jonas remained silent, letting Pierce's words hang in the air. The overseer's monologue revealed his location precisely, confirmed that he was still following the false trail, still moving toward the trap. After a moment, Pierce started walking again, his lantern swinging, his boots crushing cotton stalks as he pushed deeper into the field. Jonas counted his steps, visualizing the distance remaining, preparing for what was about to happen. 5 steps, 4, 3. Pierce was almost directly over the trap now. 2 more steps, and he would reach the weakest point, where Jonas had deliberately thinned the covering, where the boards would give way under the weight of a full-grown man. Jonas held his breath, every muscle in his body tense, knowing that the next few seconds would determine whether his plan succeeded or whether he would face immediate execution for his attempt. Pierce took another step. The ground held. 1 more step, just 1 more, and he would be standing exactly where Jonas needed him. The overseer moved forward, still talking to himself, still confident in his power and authority, still utterly unaware that the ground beneath his feet was about to transform from solid earth into empty air. The covering collapsed. Pierce's lantern arced through the darkness as he fell, his body crashing down into the pit with a heavy thud that drove the air from his lungs. The lantern struck the pit's edge and went out, plunging the field into absolute darkness. For a moment there was only silence, broken by Pierce's gasping attempts to draw breath. Jonas moved forward quickly, his feet finding the pit's edge by memory and careful measurement. He knelt and looked down into the darkness where Pierce lay. The overseer was alive. Jonas could hear him groaning, trying to orient himself, trying to understand what had happened. Soon Pierce would begin shouting for help, would try to climb out, would become dangerous again. Jonas could not allow that. He stood and walked to where he had hidden the shovel, his hands closing around its wooden handle with grim purpose. The tool felt heavy, solid, real in a way that made everything that was about to happen feel inevitable. Jonas returned to the pit's edge and waited for Pierce to regain enough breath to speak. When the overseer finally found his voice, it was filled with rage and disbelief. Pierce demanded to know what had happened. Who had dug the pit? Who would pay for this outrage? His voice rose, threatening, commanding, still trying to assert authority even from the bottom of a hole. Jonas listened to this display of impotent fury, heard in it the voice of every overseer, every slave owner, every person who had convinced themselves that power over others was their natural right. Then Jonas spoke, his voice calm and clear in the darkness. He said one word, Eliza. And in that single name lay all the explanation that was needed, all the justice that was being claimed, all the reckoning that Pierce had brought upon himself. The overseer fell silent, understanding flooding through him. He knew who Jonas was, remembered Eliza's death as one might remember swatting a fly, a casual act of violence that had seemed inconsequential at the time. Now, in the darkness of the pit, Pierce finally understood that actions have consequences, that even the most oppressed can find ways to demand justice, that the system he had served so brutally could not protect him from the judgment of those he had tormented. Jonas raised the shovel and began to fill the pit. Each shovelful of earth fell with a soft thump, covering Pierce's legs first, then his torso, the weight of the soil pinning him in place, making struggle impossible. Pierce began to scream, but Jonas had chosen his location well. The sound carried only a short distance before being absorbed by the cotton plants and the vast emptiness of the night. And in truth, the workers in the quarters, even if they heard something, would not investigate. They would pull their thin blankets tighter and tell themselves they had heard only the wind or an animal or a dream. They would protect their own ignorance because to know was to become complicit, and complicity meant danger. Jonas worked steadily, his movements methodical, his breathing controlled. He felt no joy in what he was doing, but neither did he feel doubt. This was justice, rough and terrible, as justice must sometimes be when law and morality have been perverted by systems of oppression. Eliza could not be brought back, but her death could be answered, her life could be valued in the only currency available to those who lived in bondage. Pierce had believed that enslaved people were things to be used and discarded. Jonas was demonstrating that they were human beings, capable of memory, of planning, of executing complex acts of resistance that the system had insisted were impossible. The screaming stopped before the pit was half full. Whether Pierce had lost consciousness or simply lost hope, Jonas did not know and did not care. He continued shoveling until the hole was completely filled, then used his feet to tamp down the earth, making it firm and compact. He scattered cotton stalks over the disturbed soil, arranged them to match the surrounding field, erased every sign of what had occurred. By the time he finished, the first faint gray of dawn was beginning to lighten the eastern sky. Jonas returned the shovel to its place, cleaned his hands and face at the water barrel, and slipped back into his cabin through the loose board. He lay down on his sleeping pallet just as the morning bell began to ring, calling the workers to another day of labor. His body was exhausted, but his mind was clear and calm. He had done what needed to be done, had acted with intelligence and precision, had demonstrated that even in the most oppressive circumstances, the human spirit could assert itself through acts of calculated resistance. When the workers filed out to the fields that morning, Jonas was among them, his face showing nothing, his movements steady and unremarkable. And somewhere beneath their feet, in a cotton field that had witnessed so much suffering, lay a man who had believed himself untouchable, buried by the same hands he had sought to break, defeated by the same mind he had presumed to control. The earth had taken back its own, as Jonas had promised Eliza it would. Justice, rough and imperfect though it was, had been served by those the system insisted were incapable of such things. And in that act lay a truth that no amount of oppression could suppress. The human mind, when pushed beyond endurance, will find ways to resist, to rebel, to reclaim dignity through acts of courage that transform victims into agents of their own liberation. The morning sun rose over the Louisiana Delta with its usual indifference to human affairs, casting long shadows across the cotton fields where Jonas stood with the other workers, waiting for the day's assignments. The overseer did not appear. This in itself was unusual enough to cause murmurs among the enslaved people. Quiet observations passed from person to person. Harlan Pierce was known for his rigid adherence to schedule, his presence at dawn as reliable as the sunrise itself. His absence created a void that felt almost physical, a space where fear and authority had stood now suddenly empty. Jonas maintained his composed expression, betraying nothing, though his senses remained alert to every detail of how the morning was unfolding. The plantation's owner, Nathaniel Crawford, emerged from the great house an hour after sunrise, his face showing irritation at having to oversee the field assignments himself. Crawford was a man who preferred to remain distant from the actual mechanisms of slavery, comfortable with profiting from the system, but unwilling to confront its daily brutalities. He relied on Pierce to maintain order, to extract labor, to handle the unpleasant necessities that kept the plantation profitable. Now, with his overseer missing, Crawford found himself forced into direct contact with people he preferred to think of as property rather than human beings. Crawford questioned the workers about Pierce's whereabouts. Had anyone seen him after his rounds the previous night? Had anyone heard anything unusual? The responses were uniform shakes of the head, expressions of ignorance that were both genuine and protective. Jonas was asked directly, his name called out from the group, and he stepped forward with appropriate deference, his eyes downcast in the posture of submission that white authority expected. He said he had heard nothing, seen nothing, knew nothing. Crawford studied him for a moment, perhaps sensing something beneath the surface, but finding no evidence to justify suspicion, he dismissed Jonas with a wave of his hand. The search began in earnest by mid-morning. Crawford organized some of the enslaved men into search parties, sending them through the fields, along the roads, into the swamps at the plantation's edge. They searched the tool sheds, the stables, the storage barns. They checked Pierce's quarters, finding his belongings undisturbed, his bed slept in, suggesting he had begun his nightly rounds and simply vanished somewhere along his usual route. The lantern was missing, which supported the theory that he had been carrying it when whatever befell him occurred. Jonas was assigned to a search party that covered the eastern fields, the very area where Pierce now lay buried. He walked the rows alongside other workers, calling out the overseer's name, looking behind buildings and under equipment, all while knowing that they were walking over the man they sought. It was a surreal experience, this performance of concern for a man he had killed, but Jonas understood that every aspect of his behavior would be scrutinized if suspicion later arose. He needed to appear as innocent and ignorant as everyone else, needed to participate fully in the search, needed to show appropriate worry about the overseer's disappearance. As the day progressed and no trace of Pierce emerged, the theories began to circulate. Crawford believed his overseer had been attacked by a runaway, perhaps someone hiding in the swamps, waiting for an opportunity to strike back at the system that had oppressed them. This theory satisfied Crawford's understanding of how enslaved people behaved, validated his belief that they were dangerous and required constant control, and allowed him to avoid considering more troubling possibilities. Other workers, speaking quietly among themselves, suggested that Pierce might have fallen into a ravine, or been bitten by a snake, or met with some other natural accident that had claimed his body. No one suggested that an enslaved person still working on the plantation might have planned and executed Pierce's disappearance. Such an act required premeditation, intelligence, courage, and capability that the system insisted these people did not possess. It was cognitively easier for Crawford and the other white authorities to believe in an attack by a desperate runaway or a random accident than to consider that someone they saw every day, someone they believed they controlled completely, might have outsmarted them all. This blindness was Jonas's greatest protection. The very prejudices that justified slavery also prevented those in power from recognizing resistance when it happened right in front of them. They could not conceive that an enslaved person might possess the intellectual capacity to plan something as complex as Jonas had executed. Their own racist assumptions created a shield of invisibility around his actions. By evening, Crawford had sent word to neighboring plantations, asking if they had seen any suspicious activity, any signs of runaways, anything that might explain Pierce's disappearance. He also sent riders to town to report the incident to local authorities and to organize a more extensive search. The following day brought slave catchers with their dogs, men experienced in tracking runaways through the swamps and forests. They examined the ground around Pierce's quarters, picked up his scent, and followed it along his usual route through the fields. Jonas watched the dogs work, his heart rate elevated, but his exterior calm. The animals followed Pierce's trail to the eastern section of the field, moving along the paths where the overseer had walked on his final night. But the trail ended abruptly at a spot near where Jonas had thrown his stones, where Pierce had stood, listening before following the false trail deeper into the field. The dogs circled, confused, unable to pick up the scent beyond that point. The rain that had fallen 2 nights after Pierce's burial had washed away any remaining traces of his path. Any disturbance in the soil that might have told a story. The slave catchers concluded that Pierce had been attacked at that spot by someone who had concealed their own scent carefully, perhaps using water or specific herbs to mask their trail. They suggested that the body had been carried away, either into the swamp or to some pre-prepared hiding place. Crawford accepted this explanation, which confirmed his existing beliefs and required no deeper examination of plantation security or his understanding of the people he enslaved. As days turned into weeks, the search eventually diminished and then ceased entirely. Pierce was declared missing, presumed dead, though his body had not been recovered. Crawford hired a new overseer, a man named Thomas Wade, who was younger and perhaps slightly less overtly cruel, though still a representative of the same system, still wielding the same fundamental power over life and death. The plantation's rhythms resumed their normal patterns. Cotton was picked, bales were shipped, profits were recorded. Life if such a word could be applied to existence under bondage, continued. But something had changed in the quarters, something subtle that could not be measured or quantified, but was felt nonetheless. The workers moved with slightly less fear. They spoke a bit more freely among themselves. There was a sense, unspoken but shared, that the world was not as immutable as they had been told, that the power structures that seemed so absolute could be challenged, could be overcome by intelligence and planning. They did not know for certain what had happened to Pierce, but they suspected, and their suspicions gave them something precious: hope. Jonas became a figure of quiet respect in the community. No one asked him direct questions about Pierce's disappearance. No one needed to. They saw in his eyes a calm that had not been there before, a sense of purpose fulfilled. Old Sarah would sometimes nod at him as he passed, a gesture of acknowledgement that needed no words. Young mothers would point him out to their children, not saying anything explicit, but teaching them through example that dignity could be maintained even in chains, that the mind could remain free even when the body was bound. The cotton field where Pierce lay buried became known among the workers as the silent patch. They would walk through it with a particular awareness, their steps a bit lighter, their backs a bit straighter. The cotton that grew there seemed to them to grow taller, fuller, as if the earth itself had been nourished by justice. This was probably imagination, a need to find meaning in the landscape of their oppression. But imagination, too, is a form of resistance, a way of reclaiming narrative from those who would write all the stories. Jonas continued to work the fields season after season. He never spoke of what he had done, never confirmed the suspicions that circulated in whispers. His silence was not shame, but wisdom. To speak would be to endanger himself and potentially others. The system still existed, still held power over their lives, still demanded absolute control. But Jonas had proven something important, that within the brutal constraints of slavery, individual acts of resistance remained possible, that intelligence and planning could overcome even the most violent oppression, that the human spirit could assert itself through calculated acts of defiance that no law or custom could prevent. The new overseer, Thomas Wade, never achieved the same level of absolute control that Pierce had wielded. There was something in the workers' eyes now that gave him pause, a sense that they were not quite as powerless as the system claimed they were. Wade was practical enough to recognize that fear alone could not guarantee obedience, that there were limits to how far violence could be pushed before it provoked reactions that authority could not control. He maintained discipline, extracted labor, enforced the plantation's rules, but with a wariness that suggested he understood that overseers too could disappear, that the earth held secrets, that justice could come from unexpected directions. For Jonas, the seasons passed with the same agricultural rhythms they always had: spring planting, summer cultivation, fall harvest, winter's brief respite. The cotton grew and was picked, the soil was tilled and planted again. But Jonas himself had been transformed by what he had done. The grief for Eliza remained with him always, a permanent wound that shaped his interior landscape. But alongside the grief existed something else, the knowledge that he had acted, that he had refused to accept victimhood as his final identity, that he had demonstrated agency in a system designed to deny such things were possible. He thought often about what his act of resistance meant. It had not ended slavery. It had not freed anyone. It had not changed the fundamental injustice of the system that held him and everyone he knew in bondage. But it had proven something essential about human nature, that the capacity for strategic thought, for planning, for executing complex acts of resistance, could not be suppressed no matter how complete the oppression appeared. The mind remained free, even when the body was enslaved, and that freedom, once recognized, could never be completely taken away. Jonas also understood that his act carried moral complexity that he would spend the rest of his life considering. He had killed a man, buried him alive, a death that was cruel and terrible, even if the victim had been a perpetrator of countless cruelties himself. Was this justice or simply revenge? Was there a difference in a world where legal justice was unavailable to the oppressed? Jonas did not pretend to have easy answers to these questions. He had acted from a place of profound grief and accumulated rage, had done what seemed necessary in a moment when all other options had been foreclosed. Whether history would judge him favorably or harshly, he could not know and could not control. What he could control was his own integrity in the years that followed. Jonas became a person that others turned to for counsel, for wisdom, for the kind of steady presence that helped people endure. He used his intelligence not just for his own survival, but to help others navigate the impossible challenges of enslaved life. He taught children their numbers in secret, passing on the knowledge he had accumulated. He helped settle disputes among workers before they could escalate into situations that would draw Wade's attention. He became, in his quiet way, a leader not through any formal position, but through the respect he commanded by his example. The years passed, and Jonas grew older, his back bent slightly from decades of field labor. His hands became gnarled from handling cotton bolls and farm tools. Gray appeared in his hair, then dominated it, but his mind remained sharp, his memory intact, his spirit unbroken. He carried within him the knowledge of what he had done, carried it not as a burden but as a testament to the fact that even in the darkest circumstances, human beings could find ways to assert their dignity, to demand recognition of their humanity, to resist systems that sought to reduce them to mere instruments of labor and profit. And beneath the cotton field, in the silent patch where workers walked with particular awareness, Harlan Pierce remained. The earth had claimed him, had transformed his body into soil and nutrients, had made him part of the landscape he had once dominated. The cotton grew over his grave each season, white bowls emerging from dark earth, a yearly reminder that all power is temporary, that all authority is contingent, that the wheel of justice turns slowly but turns nonetheless. The field held its secret well, revealing nothing to those who searched, but speaking volumes to those who understood what silence could mean. Jonas knew that eventually he would join Eliza and Pierce in that same earth. Death came for everyone, enslaved and free alike, oppressor and oppressed. But in the years between his act of resistance and his eventual death, Jonas lived with the knowledge that he had refused to accept the identity that slavery sought to impose upon him. He had demonstrated that the system's fundamental premise was false, that enslaved people possessed the same intellectual capabilities, the same capacity for complex planning, the same ability to execute acts of strategic resistance as any free person. His life, and the manner in which he had chosen to respond to Eliza's murder, stood as testimony to the indomitable nature of the human spirit when confronted with injustice. The cotton field continued its cycles, indifferent to human drama, simply growing and being harvested, season after season, year after year. But for those who worked it, who knew its secrets, who understood what lay beneath certain sections of soil, the field was more than just a place of labor. It was a monument to resistance, a reminder that the oppressed are never as powerless as the oppressors wish them to be, a testament to the fact that justice, though delayed and imperfect, could still be claimed by those brave enough and patient enough to plan for it, to wait for the right moment and to act with the full capacity of their human intelligence and determination. In the years that followed Harlan Pierce's disappearance, something remarkable began to happen. Stories started to circulate, not just on the Crawford plantation, but across neighboring estates, through the hidden networks of communication that enslaved people maintained, despite all efforts to isolate them. These stories spoke of an overseer who had vanished without trace, of a plot that had been executed with perfect precision, of justice served by hands that the system claimed were capable only of mindless labor. The stories never mentioned Jonas by name, at least not in the versions that traveled beyond those who knew the truth, but they carried his legacy nonetheless. The tale transformed as it spread, as stories always do when they pass from mouth to mouth, from plantation to plantation. Some versions spoke of multiple conspirators. Others suggested supernatural intervention, divine justice visited upon a cruel man. Still others claimed that the overseer had been lured into the swamp and consumed by its murky depths. But beneath all these variations lay a core truth that resonated with everyone who heard it, that an enslaved person had outsmarted the system, had planned and executed an act of resistance that succeeded completely, had demonstrated intellectual capability and strategic thinking that slavery's justifications insisted did not exist. The story became known among the enslaved population as the Tale of the Silent Patch, named for the section of cotton field where workers claimed they could sometimes hear whispers in the wind, the earth itself speaking of secrets it would never reveal to those in power. This naming was itself significant, a way of marking territory, of claiming space within the landscape of oppression and transforming it into something meaningful. The silent patch became a symbol, a place that represented the possibility of resistance, the idea that even the most complete systems of control contained vulnerabilities that intelligence and courage could exploit. Overseers on other plantations heard versions of the story too, and while they dismissed the supernatural elements and refused to believe that any enslaved person could have planned something so sophisticated, the tale nonetheless affected them. They became slightly more cautious in their rounds, more aware that the darkness held potential dangers, more conscious that their authority, though backed by law and violence, was not absolute. This wariness was itself a victory of sorts, a small redistribution of fear that had previously flowed in only one direction. The powerful, for perhaps the first time, had to consider that they too might be vulnerable, that their control was not as total as they had believed. The story reached other enslaved people who were planning their own acts of resistance. Some were contemplating escape, mapping routes north, gathering supplies for the dangerous journey toward freedom. Others were considering smaller acts of sabotage, ways to slow production, to resist the relentless extraction of their labor. The tale of the silent patch gave these people something crucial, a model of successful resistance, proof that careful planning could overcome even armed authority, evidence that the system's claims about the intellectual inferiority of enslaved people were lies designed to justify oppression. Among the free black population in New Orleans and other southern cities, the story also circulated, often in more accurate versions that acknowledged human agency rather than attributing events to supernatural forces. Free black people lived in a precarious position, their liberty always conditional, always subject to the whims of white authority. But they maintained connections to the enslaved population, helped where they could, and passed along stories that reinforced pride and resistance. The tale of Jonas, though his name was often omitted for safety, became part of a broader oral tradition of resistance, joining other stories of people who had struck back against oppression, who had refused to accept the identity that slavery sought to impose. As years passed and the tensions that would eventually lead to the Civil War intensified, the story took on new significance. Abolitionists, both black and white, collected narratives of slavery's brutality seeking to persuade the broader public that the institution was fundamentally immoral and had to be ended. The tale of the silent patch, in various forms, found its way into these collections. Some versions were embellished to make them more dramatic, more appealing to readers who had never experienced slavery firsthand. Others were stripped down to bare facts, presented as evidence of the violence inherent in the system and the extraordinary measures enslaved people sometimes took to defend themselves and their loved ones. Frederick Douglass, himself an escaped slave and perhaps the most prominent black intellectual of the 19th century, heard the story during his travels and spoke of it in modified form during his lectures. He used it to illustrate a point he made repeatedly, that enslaved people possessed the same human capabilities as any free person, that they were not docile or content as slavery's defenders claimed, and that they resisted their oppression in countless ways, both large and small. The intelligence required to plan and execute an act like the one attributed to Jonas was, Douglass argued, proof that the supposed intellectual differences between races were fabrications designed to justify exploitation. On the Crawford plantation itself, the story became part of the community's secret history, passed down from generation to generation. Parents told their children, who told their own children, creating a chain of memory that stretched across decades. Jonas himself lived into his 60s, surviving to see the early years of the Civil War, though he did not live long enough to witness emancipation. In his final years, he was respected as an elder, someone whose life had demonstrated principles that could guide others. He never spoke directly about Pierce's death, maintaining to the end the silence that had protected him, but his life spoke eloquently of resistance and dignity maintained under impossible circumstances. When Jonas died in 1862, he was buried in the small cemetery at the edge of the plantation, a section of ground reserved for enslaved people, marked with simple wooden crosses that would deteriorate and disappear within decades. But his legacy did not require a permanent marker. It lived in the memories of those who had known him, in the stories that continued to circulate, in the example he had set of intellectual resistance to oppression. The Civil War brought tremendous upheaval to Louisiana and the entire South. Union forces occupied much of the state, and enslaved people fled plantations in massive numbers, seeking freedom behind Union lines. The Crawford plantation was abandoned in 1863, when Nathaniel Crawford fled before advancing Union troops. The great house was looted and then fell into disrepair. The cotton fields were left untended, and the carefully maintained rows dissolved into wild growth. But even as the plantation disappeared, the story of what had happened there persisted. After emancipation, when formerly enslaved people could speak more freely, more detailed versions of the tale emerged. Some who had been present when Pierce disappeared came forward with their recollections. They spoke of Jonas with respect and admiration, describing him as a man of exceptional intelligence who had done what needed to be done to avenge his wife and demonstrate that enslaved people were fully human, fully capable of complex thought and action. The site of the old plantation became a place of pilgrimage for some. Freed people would return to walk the grounds where they had once been held in bondage, to remember those who had not survived to see freedom, to mark the transition from slavery to liberty. The silent patch, though the exact location was eventually forgotten as the field returned to natural growth, remained a symbol. People claimed they could feel something in that section of the old plantation, a weight of history, a sense of significance that transcended the ordinary landscape. In the decades that followed the Civil War, during the period known as Reconstruction and then the Jim Crow era that followed, the story of Jonas continued to resonate. Black communities in the South faced new forms of oppression, systems of segregation and discrimination that, while not slavery, still denied them full equality and subjected them to violence and degradation. In this context, the tale of the silent patch reminded people that resistance was possible, that intelligence and planning could overcome power, that dignity could be maintained, and justice could be claimed even in the most oppressive circumstances. The story was passed down through families, told at gatherings, shared as an example of courage and strategic thinking. Some historians collected these oral traditions, recognizing their value as records of resistance that were often excluded from official histories. The tale of Jonas appeared in various forms in books and articles about slave resistance, sometimes accurately, sometimes with embellishments, but always carrying the core truth that enslaved people fought back against their oppression in whatever ways were available to them. In the 20th century, during the civil rights movement, activists and leaders drew inspiration from stories like Jonas's. They saw in his example a model of strategic resistance, of using intelligence and planning to overcome systems of oppression. The movement's leaders emphasized nonviolent resistance, which was different from Jonas's methods, but they shared with him the understanding that oppression could be fought through intelligent action, through careful planning, through refusal to accept the inferior identity that racism sought to impose. The story also raised complex questions about the nature of justice and the ethics of resistance. Jonas had killed a man, albeit a man who had murdered his wife and committed countless other acts of cruelty. Was his action justified? In a system where legal justice was unavailable to enslaved people, where the law itself was an instrument of oppression, what options remained? These questions did not have easy answers, and different people drew different conclusions. But the story's power lay not in providing simple moral certainties, but in forcing engagement with the difficult realities that oppressed people faced, with the impossible choices that systems of injustice created. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, as historians worked to recover more complete accounts of slavery and resistance, Jonas's story was recognized as part of a broader pattern. Research revealed that enslaved people had resisted in countless ways, from subtle acts of daily resistance to organized rebellions, from cultural preservation to strategic violence. The tale of the silent patch was one thread in a vast tapestry of resistance, each story representing individuals who had refused to accept their oppression, who had maintained their humanity in the face of systems designed to deny it. The cotton field where Jonas had enacted his plan had long since been reclaimed by nature. Trees grew where cotton plants once stood. The exact location of Pierce's grave was lost to time and vegetation, but in a deeper sense, the place remained significant. It represented a moment when an individual had asserted agency against overwhelming power, when intelligence had overcome violence, when justice, however rough and imperfect, had been claimed by one who had been denied access to any legitimate means of seeking it. Today, when we look back across the centuries to Jonas's life and actions, we see both a specific individual and a symbol of broader truths about human nature and resistance to oppression. His story reminds us that systems of power, no matter how complete they appear, contain vulnerabilities. It teaches us that intelligence and planning can overcome even violent authority. It demonstrates that the capacity for strategic thought, for complex action, for resistance to injustice cannot be suppressed by any system of oppression, no matter how brutal or comprehensive. Jonas's legacy extends beyond the boundaries of his own time and place. His story speaks to anyone who has faced oppression, anyone who has been told they are inferior, anyone who has been denied justice by systems of power. It affirms the fundamental equality of human intelligence and capability. It validates the impulse to resist, to refuse to accept degrading identities, to claim dignity even when all external circumstances deny it. The tale also serves as a reminder of the costs of oppression, both to those who are oppressed and to those who oppress. Eliza died because of a system that reduced human beings to property, that gave some people absolute power over others, that allowed cruelty to flourish without consequence. Pierce died because he participated in that system, because he used his power to inflict suffering, because he forgot or never knew that even the most powerless possess the capacity to respond, to resist, to seek justice. The system created both victims and perpetrators, destroyed lives on both sides of its fundamental divide, and left wounds that would take generations to even begin to heal. In the end, Jonas's story is not just about one man's act of resistance. It is about the indomitable nature of the human spirit when confronted with injustice. It is about the power of intelligence to overcome violence. It is about the capacity of every person, regardless of circumstances, to assert their humanity, to refuse to be reduced to less than they are, to claim agency even in the most oppressive systems. These are lessons that transcend any particular historical moment, that speak to fundamental truths about what it means to be human. The silent patch exists now only in memory and story, but that is perhaps the most powerful form of existence for such a place. Physical locations decay and disappear, but stories endure, carrying forward the truths they embody, inspiring new generations, teaching lessons that remain relevant across time. Jonas's story has traveled from the cotton fields of Louisiana across more than a century and a half, reaching people who face their own struggles against oppression, who need reminders that resistance is possible, that intelligence and courage can overcome even the most daunting systems of power. We tell this story now not to glorify violence, for there is nothing glorious about the circumstances that made Jonas's actions seem necessary. We tell it instead to honor the full humanity of people who lived under slavery, to recognize their intelligence and agency, to understand that they were not passive victims, but active participants in their own history, fighting against their oppression in whatever ways were available to them. We tell it to remember that justice, while best pursued through lawful and peaceful means, has sometimes had to be claimed by other methods when all legitimate avenues were closed. We tell it to understand the complex moral landscape that oppression creates, where choices are never simple and where survival itself can be an act of resistance. And we tell it because Jonas's story, like all stories of resistance against oppression, reminds us that the arc of history, though long and often brutal, does bend toward justice. Not inevitably, not without struggle, not without cost, but through the accumulated actions of individuals who refuse to accept injustice, who insist on their own humanity, who use whatever capabilities they possess to resist systems of oppression. Jonas was one such individual, and his story echoes across time, a testament to courage, to intelligence, to the unbreakable human spirit that no chains can fully bind, no system can completely suppress, no oppression can ultimately defeat. In remembering Jonas, we honor not just one man, but all who have resisted, all who have refused to accept degradation, all who have fought for justice and dignity in whatever ways their circumstances allowed. His story is their story, and their story is ultimately the story of humanity's long and continuing struggle to recognize the equal worth and capability of every person, to build systems of justice rather than oppression, to create a world where no one needs to make the terrible choices that Jonas faced in that Louisiana cotton field so many years ago.